diversa, qui non so, la linea lì, come sarà qua? Mazze di là, no siamo sbilanciati, mazze di là che due di là.
Mi ha detto di entrare,
Te?
no, ho detto pronti, ho detto pronti, non ho detto pronti. Ragazzi, è stato così.
quindi è spazio per una pagina. Ok, quindi devo passare le pagine. Siamo un po' stretti, eh? Mannaggia. Vabbè. Ok.
Mettere giù il foglio che hai già letto.
Sì, però è troppo ingombrante. Niente,
Qualsiasi
passo.
cosa, io sono qui,
Vai.
Se mi fai un cenno, nessun problema, ok?
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. The event is to start.
dice lui, adesso dice lui. No, che discorso.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And on behalf of the European University Institute, welcome to the annual State of the Union Conference, Women in Europe and the World. We are extremely honored to be here again in Palazzo Vecchio for the 6th edition in a row of the State of the Union to facilitate discussion among academics, policymakers, journalists, and practitioners on issues of deep importance to our European Union. As our first speaker, I'm pleased to invite Mr. Dario Nardella, Mayor of the City of Florence, to deliver his welcome address.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Florence, welcome to Palazzo Vecchio, in this beautiful Salone dei Cinquecento, the heart of a Renaissance of Florentine beauty. When in 2010 we promoted with the EUI the first edition of the State of the Union, for Florence it was like finding again both its reasons of identity and its ancient vocation, which are, however, remarkably contemporary. Florence, city of the world, universal icon of beauty, a crossroads of cultures and civilizations for its ancient dimensions. Florence as political hub, a city with dozens of universities and research centers, which has never ceased to gather energy and contemporary thought from the perspective of its current vocation. Our city, the capital of historical humanism, thus regain its identity and function also thanks to institutions like the EUI, with which Florence is building a bridge towards Europe, giving birth to a new humanism. We need it more than ever nowadays, because, as Professor Joseph Weiler, thank you Joseph, underlined on the occasion of the recent press conference of this edition, the State of the Union is not good. Never, as in this time since its beginning, the European Union has to face so many crises together: the economic crisis, the referendum in Great Britain, the threatens the European integrations, terrorism and the migrants' emergency, linked to the wars in the Mediterranean area. These 5 European emergencies have a worldwide impact, and they represent for all of us as many challenges. economic growth and monetary union, social integration that in these days is underlying the crucial role of women, and security. There is a challenge, however, that embraces all the previous ones. It is the educational policy challenge that calls for the full recovery of the values and ideals at the basis of the European unifications. As stated by Altiero Spinelli, who titled one of his autobiographies, The Drop and the Rock, just to signify that the idea of Europe can, drop by drop, erode the rock. Therefore, we cannot allow for our citizens, for our children, that selfishness and populism which generate hate and divisions. In our recent and past history, every time our continent has experienced divisions, these have consequently led to conflicts, deprivation, and tragedy. Today, some political parties and governments wish to build new divisions through barriers, wire fences, and boundaries. But the history of Europe has taught us that barriers can only cause lacerations to people and states. These parties and these states cannot be defined as Europeans. In the preamble of the Treaty of Rome, the founders of the European Community signed the treaty declared essere decisi ad assicurare mediante
to be decided to ensure the economic and social progress of their countries, eliminating the barriers which separate Europe.
Through a common action, the economic and social progress of countries by eliminating the barriers which divide Europe. By eliminating the barriers which divide Europe. Where is the determination of these states? Where is the common action directed to eliminate these barriers which are being raised again? It is not time for debates. It is time for action. Facing these challenges can make Europe more united and stronger. Just take a look at the extraordinary resources we have. Europe of the people is the Europe of cities. An effective example is given by the bond between the EUI and our city, showing the path to take towards a model of government capable to keep Europe anchored to territories, cities and local communities. A model inspired by the recent cohesion policies outlined in Brussels, but which needs to be developed with much more determination. Florence has in its DNA the capability to have a prominent role in the debate on major international issues, such as when, at the initiative of Mayor Giorgio La Pira, the city was able to bring together here, in Salone dei 500, the mayors of the capital cities worldwide to work for peace. Last November, in the same place, to celebrate the 5th anniversary of that event, we renewed the invitation to the mayors of the cities around the world. On that occasion, we have realized how necessary and actual dialogue still is among those who have the difficult task of leading central government to an authentic harmony. The city reveals to be a place where the coexistence between human beings, the concentration and the proximity can, it is true, generate conflicts, but it is also a place where possible solutions can be found. A place where all the challenges that I have mentioned become real. The city context of the associated life has characterized the European structure and history. Trades, social balances, cultural development, for us Europeans have mainly had a city qualification more than local or regional. The city, dear friends, starting from its classical dimension, has represented a fundamental social means of measurement. Every time a political perspective centered on the human being in the dialect with the concept of the nation-state has been adopted. One of the key points to facilitate the building process and the awareness of what we could define a European humanism is therefore the training of a European ruling class that shares those values and ideals. For this reason, Florence conveys its full support to the project of the School of Government promoted by EUI. It effectively appears a pressing need of our time to generate a cohesive European political class capable to animate the European political parties which, according to the treaty, contribute to create the European political awareness and to express the will of the citizens of the Union. This need to inspire communities sharing the same values makes the contribution of this institution essential. The primacy of the politics that takes on the responsibility of human limits as factors of compromise has awakened here in our city the thinking of personalities such as Machiavelli, who were capable to build the categories of political thinking to which nowadays we still refer. The city of Florence will not escape from what we believe is a task given by history and by the effort of its genesis. We will give our support to give rise to the School of Government and to develop it as a branch of the European Institute. In the cohesion made up of communities and civic institutions, Florence, European University Institute, and School of Government, it is possible to recognize a new model of institutional unit, appropriate to firmly affirm an European cultural influence worldwide, based on a concept of soft power. Only by spreading the European political culture between people and the ruling classes, like in the last century the United States and the Anglo-Saxon countries have been able to do in many parts of the world, we could affirm that we have done our effort to facilitate the growth of cohesion, solidarity, and progress in our Europe and in the world. Thank you and good job for this day to European University. Thank you.
I'm now pleased to give the floor to the President.
Adesso ho il piacere di dare la parola al Presidente della Regione Toscana. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start speaking of a snapshot that was taken in Sweden on the 1st of May. It shows Tesse Asplunda, a black woman who is very proud in the midst of Nazi radicals. In her pride, there is a symbol of a Europe that is having the seeing the failure of what we see because of the lack of solidarity. That black woman, on the one hand, represents a new resistance against all these conflicts, a Europe that opens up to civilization and braveness. The World Economic Forum publishes the Global Gender Gap, the report on gender gaps. In the 10 years between 2006 and 2015, women that had a job went from 1.5 billion to 1 billion, and salaries have not changed. The average salary today equals that of what a man was earning in 2006, $11,000, while that man today earns $21,000. This is inequality in wages, which is also visible in the European Union, where women earn 16% on average less than men. And yet women are more educated than men. This negative gap for women can also be seen in the employment rates. Women unemployment is higher in European countries compared to that of men. And all this has no justification. It is a violation, a clear violation of the principles of equality between men and women, written in all international codes, including the European treaties. In Tuscany, for some time now, we are actively working to make gender equality effective and real. Let me mention one example. Incentives for young women business owners to reconcile their working endeavors with those of the family, and to protect health for women against the abuse and gender violence, and the regional law that sees a greater presence of women in both jobs on the labor market and in institutions. And so the principles of the European Union and the freedom of women as an international process come together. These principles of freedom and equality on which Europe is based, which we expect quite rightly to be characterized by the principles of modern civilization, should be also true for women immigrants. And we must open up through our values. We cannot take charges of a suffering humanity which is knocking at our doors, but we must also welcome them with the integrity of our values. The defense of the European civilization cannot just remain an abstract principle. What I'd like to highlight here is only a matter of fact. Namely, there is a cultural gap between a modernness which gives value to equality among genders, between genders, and produces freedom, and then a vision which is backward and which stops the growth of women and the freedom of women, and therefore of society at large. This, unfortunately, is the case in some extreme fundamentalist Islamism movements, where the equality of gender is a fundamental issue. I believe that defending the civilization of Europe today means more than ever being on the side of women wherever we are in the world. Thank you very much.
We would now invite Mr. Leonardo Basiliki, President of the...
Let me invite now Mr. Leonardo Basiliki, Chairman of the Florence Board of Trade, Chamber of Commerce.
I wish you all the warmest of welcomes to the Palazzo Vecchio. And I would also like to sincerely thank the European University Institute for promoting this momentous conference, the State of the Union. As a businessman and as president of the Florence Chamber of Commerce, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight a certain fact to the institutional representatives, academics and journalists present here today. Florence is challenging itself, and it has never before in history. It is not an individual success of our flourishing cultural, developing economy, or prosperous institutional relationships that make Florence great. I believe that it's a sum of this success that make this city strong in the eyes of Europe and the rest of the world. I say this not to please some nor to offend others, but to remind Europe and the rest of the world that Florence can be counted on, that they can trust in our political, cultural, and economic institutions, as well as in our ability to discuss and negotiate. This is the first time that the Italian Chamber of Commerce is a key participant in an event of such caliber and intellectual stature. We involved ourselves in this project because we believe that the good work carried out by the European University Institute and his president, thanks. Their drive, the discussion, and their support of the paramount roles that women play in Europe and throughout the world, the themes of this event, deserve recognition. I also believe that taking part in this conference will help us to strengthen our knowledge on freedom, equality, and peace, thereby helping us become a catalyst in global economic growth. We know that even in the most advanced and evolved economies, disputes can undermine and inhibit growth and progress. Being able to prevent this outcome was our greatest incentive in contributing to this conference. In your folders, you'll find all the materials needed to learn more about the new international mediation services with the highest quality standards for citizens and businesses, supported and promoted by Florence Chamber of Commerce. Sorry for advertising. There have been too many times in history that the economy has been the cause of conflict and war. I believe that the conversation we are having now will help to change this, turning the economy into an opportunity for dialogue, sharing, exchange to unite. This is the reason why I'm confident in the work carried out here today. Thank you to all the participants here who come from near and far. I would like to close this brief introduction by saying, Viva le donne, viva l'Europa unita.
I would like now to introduce and present Professor Jean-Émile Gambert, President of the High Council of the European University Institute.
Mr. Mayor of Florence, Mr. President of Tuscany, Mr. President of the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. President of the European University Institute, dear friend, Madame Ono, there is no woman for these welcome addresses. Ladies and gentlemen, few welcoming words in the name of the High Council of the European University Institute, and thus in the name of the 21 state members of the Institute. Sixth edition of the annual Conference on the State of the Union. This conference settles down as being a major event, privileged moment of interaction between the women and the men in charge of European policy and those developing research in social sciences. The topic chosen this year for the 40th anniversary of the European University Institute is focusing on one of the founding principles of European Union, the equality between women and men. But allow I to dedicate these few minutes of intervention to a more specific question on the European University Institute. In fact, I want to jump at the opportunity that is given to me to pay tribute to its president, Joseph Weiler. It is indeed the last time when the Conference on the State of the Union is organized by the European Institute chaired by Professor Joseph Weiler. Everyone knows his exceptional career. It is a world-leading expert in international law. It is enough to underline that Joseph Weiler was made doctor honoris causa of 15 universities throughout the world to give evidence of his scientific importance. Leading researcher, committed researcher also, as give evidence of his positions asserted to defend the religious pluralism. It escapes nobody that such a commitment for a respectful secularism is essential today. This constant concern of opening is a mark of the orientation President Weiler gave to the European University Institute. That is the meaning of the priority given to the development of the reception of young researchers stemming from extra-community countries. Here the stake is double. The abolition of frontiers, which have no sense in the university world, but also the confirmation of the place of Florence European University Institute among the world-leading universities. It is also the concern of opening that underlies the very next membership of a 22nd member state, Bulgaria, and the discussions open with Turkey. Last but not least, President Weiler put on rails an ambitious project, the project of Florence School of European and Transnational Governance that aims at stressing the valorization of research in social sciences in the conduct of the European policy. In the name of the High Council, it's my pleasure, President Joseph Weiler, to thank you publicly. Thank you.
I'm now inviting the President of the European University Institute, Professor Joseph Weiler, to the floor.
Abbiamo tanti presidenti, allora cara Presidente.
We got many presidents, so dear President, dear members of the public, my first duty is to introduce our new Secretary General, Vincenzo Scroppa, Ambassador Vincenzo Scroppa, and I'd like to invite him to read a message from the President of the Italian Republic.
Grazie. Grazie.
Thank you, dear President. Obviously, I'm very moved because I'm very excited because it's my first opportunity to be at the State of the Union meeting. I'd like to read the telegram which the President of the Italian Republic has sent to us and to President Weiler. I wish to address a very warm greeting to the guests and the organizers of the 6th edition of the meeting on the State of the Union initiative organized by the European University Institute, which this year is marking 40 years of activity. The topic chosen this year, the role of women in Europe and the world, holds priority importance. The European Union has gone a long way to highlight women's roles in all areas and to fill the gaps of equality between men and women which still exist in a number of areas. However, ensuring the full deployment of women's potential in the employment market and in the social fabric of European countries remains a goal still to be achieved, starting with presence in institutions nationally and in Europe. The role of women is essential not only in economic growth but also for the promotion of rights to education, social cohesion, conflict resolution and the building of safer and more peaceful communities. The women bring new approaches and a natural attitude to mediation and an ability to dialogue and to approach diversity naturally. Today, we have to interact with these differences on an everyday basis. These these capabilities, however, have not been protected enough, and we have to do a lot to reduce physical and psychological violence against women too, making the presence of women stronger, more effective in our societies so as to fully achieve the principle of gender parity and to tear away the veil of ignorance which hinders this, is investing in our future. I'm sure that from your meeting there will be new and important inputs to this process to ensure that the role of women is better recognized to the benefit of our societies. And with this, I renew my greetings of a very successful meeting. Signed, President Sergio Mattarella.
Prendiamo il State of the Union.
So we take the State of the Union. We should not take it for granted. It is not something which we can work on alone. I wish to thank the municipality of Florence, which every year allows us to use this wonderful building. In the Talmud, it's written, "Without bread, there can be no study." I wish to thank the Chamber of Commerce of Florence, which provides us with bread. Many thanks. I was very much touched by the image mentioned by the President of the region. These two Europes in the photo taken. The problem of immigration, the problem of dismantling these walls is something which public authorities will have will be the main people responsible for this task. But we also have all of us have an individual responsibility. And in this context, I want to commend an initiative undertaken by our research workers, the members of our administrative staff, to host at the European University a number of refugees as a small contribution on our part to that crisis. It is true this is only a drop, but many drops make a sea. And so on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank the members, the staff members who've taken this initiative, and which has already begun. Mr. President Gombert, I thank you warmly, and I think that you understand, if I add nothing to what you said, it was very kind on your part. Final words. The President of the High Council said that there is no woman among those who are opening this meeting. But this year, the State of the Union address will be delivered by one of our colleagues, one of the most famous and one of our dearest colleagues, Professor Ruth Rubio Marin. It is symbolic and important that and also in view of the theme she will be addressing. So I hope that this will be a very interesting and stimulating State of the Union meeting for all of you. Thank you.
Oddio, questo io non riesco a aprirlo a metà strada, assolutamente no. Gentili ospiti, colleghi.
Dear guests, colleagues, honored officials and friends, Your Excellencies the Mothers, including those who are not present, but still must be thanked for all of us who are here, including those fathers who also did what mothers usually do, and including my own mother, who is with us in this room this morning with my children, Simone and Lucas. For me, it is a deep honor to be here in the Salone dei Cinquecento, once the meeting room for the Grand Council of the Florentine Republic, all 500 members of them being men. I am one of the many male and female voices that today will speak on the state of women in Europe and in the rest of the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is struggling and is indeed engaged in a deeper and more profound struggle than at any time since the foundation of the European Union over 6 decades ago as a human project of economic, political, and social dimensions. Europe is experiencing a protracted economic crisis with severe social implications. Europe is confronting an increased threat of terrorism, as well as the rise of populism, xenophobic nationalism, and religious fundamentalism of different creeds. The risk of Brexit has not entirely receded, even as Brexit looms ever closer, epitomizing the increasing disillusionment of many with the European project. Thousands of refugees are drowning in our seas, while thousands more, over 1 million, are calling at our doors and being denied the humane and dignified response which we know they deserve, in fact, as a matter of right. And we know this because too many of our predecessors knocked at similar doors when they too were confronted with the horrors of persecution, war, and other life-threatening forces, or because not too long ago, and for far too many, we ourselves were part of the threatening forces. Some of you may be asking yourselves, in this context, what is the use of a State of the Union devoted to women? Well, let me then ask you, is it ever the right time to ask the woman question? If we go back in history to approximately 1 century ago, when the struggle for women's right to vote was taking place in different countries in Europe, we will find plenty of examples of how women were being asked to hold back with a generosity and self-sacrifice that is so often expected of them, for the sake of other more important or more urgent causes, all of them fought in the name of freedom and equality. The socialist class struggle, nationalist movements, war efforts, or struggles to limit the power of the church and the monarchy as vestiges of the old regime. But what we acknowledge now, something that was denied back then, is that including women in European democracies in the making was also an urgent matter of equality and freedom. So too, I will claim today, Europe's democratic credentials and its commitment to social justice are at stake at this crucial juncture, and a central part of what will determine its success or failure is precisely how Europe responds to the woman question. But what exactly, you may be asking yourselves, is the woman question in Europe today? Now that women are entitled to the same rights and freedoms as men, now that we have finally erased from our legal systems the disgraceful and explicit traces of patriarchy that for years rendered women equivalent to legal minors. Well, the unfortunate reality is that today, in spite of formal equal legal status, women in Europe, who make up more than half of the population, remain an oppressed group. How can this be understood? Philosopher Iris Young, before her untimely death, explained in her writings that oppression consists of any system that reduces the potential for people to be fully human, either because they're treated in a dehumanized manner or because they're denied the opportunities that might allow them reach their full human potential in both mind and body. And remember that oppression does not only happen in cases of a cruel tyrant with bad intentions. A tyrant is not always necessary. Indeed, a well-intentioned liberal society can place system-wide constraints of groups and limit their freedoms, relying not only on overt rules, but also on unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols. Oppression has, according to Young, 5 phases, namely violence, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, and cultural imperialism. Ladies and gentlemen, we must, somewhat paradoxically, congratulate ourselves because we finally have the empirical evidence which demonstrate that women in Europe, some clearly more than others, confront those 5 phases of oppression as part of our ordinary existence. This data was gathered in rigorous studies and tools that have been developed in recent years, including the first EU-wide survey on violence against women by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights in 2014. A report based on interviews with 42,000 women across the 28 member states of the EU. We also have the excellent report of the European Commission and the Gender Equality Index reports by the European Institute for Gender Equality, which have been rigorously measuring gender equality in the European Union and its evolution between 2005 and 2012. Drawing from these, I will now explain why and how women in Europe continue to be oppressed and lay out possible scenarios for the future. I will confront the implications of these possible scenarios for Europe's self-understanding as a geopolitical space committed to democratic values and to ideas of equal justice. This commitment, I argue, should be part of the European Union's very raison d'être. Let me then start by addressing what the data tell us. In what mirrors can we find the 5 phases of European women's oppression today? First and worst, violence. Much recent public attention has been devoted to the violence perpetrated on migrant women, the Western gaze orientalizing the other women, including women who are victims of trafficking, often for sexual exploitation purposes, and girls who are subject to female genital mutilation. But the Fundamental Rights Agency's report rightly chose to talk about us and not about them. And what we know about us is that in the EU today, 1 in 3 women has experienced physical and/or sexual violence at least once since the age of 15, which makes for 59.4 million victims, with a similar ratio applying to girls under that age. Ladies and gentlemen, I have never said so publicly, but the time has come to unite and end any form of silence. I was one in the ones out of 3. What we also know is that 1 in 20, or a group about 9 million women, has been raped at least once since the age of 15, an experience which leaves survivors with fear, anger, shame, anxiety, and a loss of self-confidence. What we know is that between 45 and 55% of women in Europe have experienced sexual harassment, and that 18% of women have experienced some form of stalking, with cyber stalking becoming a new trend, especially among the young. And yet, I doubt that these figures include the forms of violence that affect migrant women, whose migration status often places them in a situation of extreme dependence on both their employers and their husbands. Or asylum seekers and refugees who, as we speak, are victims of trafficking and are being sexually abused by officials, smugglers, and other refugees in transit zones and reception centers. Or differently abled women who, by definition, often live on the periphery of society and the legal order. What is particularly painful, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that for 1 in 5 women, the experience of physical and/or sexual violence occurs at the hand of either a current or a previous partner. At the same time, scary, very scary, is the knowledge that only 14% of women reported their most serious incident of intimate partner violence to the police. Now, ladies and gentlemen, call it as you like, but to me, this means that millions of women in Europe today live in a state of terror and oppression, often within their very homes, their schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces. A word now on exploitation and marginalization, the second and third phases of oppression. Currently, the percentage of women in employment is still 63.5%. And for every euro men make, women, even in the same occupation and with the same educational level, get only 84 cents. The gender pay gap is perpetuated by the generalized practice of lack of transparency around payment by almost every employer, including our beloved European University Institute. Dearest President, perhaps the time has come to change that. Even more worrisome is that the pension gap between men and women is 38%, or the fact that 1/3 of women receive no pension at all, something which exposes women of old age, together with single mothers, to the highest risk of poverty and marginalization. Occupational segregation concentrates women in the less lucrative sectors. Employed women are still 4 times more likely to be working part-time than employed men are, mostly to combine unpaid domestic work and paid employment. In total, the discrepancy in earning that results from being paid less per hour, working few hours in paid jobs, and being underrepresented in highly paid jobs reaches 37%. And yet any data pales against the likely reality when it comes to the real gender gap in economic resources, as interestingly, gender-segregated data on resources from other financial assets, such as bonds or real estate, is simply missing. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, working men devote only 9 hours a week to unpaid care and household work, as compared with 26 hours a week for working women, who therefore bear almost 3 times the load. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, migrant women find low-wage jobs as off-the-books nannies, housekeepers, or companions for the elderly, making it easier for high-wage women to increase their hours of market work without public subsidy. Now, this market-based solution to care provision may be cost-effective in the short run, but is simply not sustainable in the long run. It deprives low-income countries where the immigrants originate from of their ability to get any revenue in return for raising and educating these people beyond voluntary and often temporary individual remittances, as well as depriving sending countries from their own care resources. To me, this exemplifies what Young calls exploitation, that is, using people's labor to produce profit while not offering them fair compensation, and also what she identifies as marginalization, the act of relegating a group of people to a lower social standing at the outer edge of society, where single mothers, eccellentissime madri, increasingly find themselves both in Europe and elsewhere. Powerlessness is the fourth phase of oppression. Women still account for less than a quarter of company board members of the largest publicly listed companies in the member states, despite representing almost half of the employed workforce. As of November 2014, they comprise only 28% of the average elected members of national parliaments and national governments. There has been some progress at the level of EU institutions, although we are far from parity. The proportion of women in the European Parliament is now at an all-time high at 37%, but still 13 points off parity. The new Commission consists of 19 men and only 9 women. Only 21% of the judges in the Court of Justice are female, and the Governing Council of the European Central Bank is comprised of 22 men and just 2 women. Needless to say, the number of women who have broken through the glass ceiling and inhabit the male domain of power, authority, and decision-making would be much lower if we were looking at low-income or migrant women. Finally, a word on cultural imperialism. At the root of gender injustice lies androcentrism, which is an institutionalized pattern of cultural value that privileges traits associated with masculinity while devaluing everything coded as feminine. Androcentric value patterns are expressly codified in many areas of the law, government policy, but also popular culture, the use of language, and everyday interaction, including in the market. Or is it by chance that stereotypically women's jobs, aside from being paid the least, are more likely to be relational and concerned with caring and provisioning, jobs that are also highly labor-intensive and with limited potential for productivity increases? The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, that the social value of care work, absolutely essential to sustain the economy and market society, eccellentissime madri, is simply not acknowledged. There is a long-standing hierarchical dualism between productive and reproductive work, and as Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz has recognized, a total lack of any relationship between private rewards and social returns. Social norms, and not any clear notion of marginal productivity, determines wages. Authors Perrons and Plomian show this well when they call our attention to the example of an executive from a failed UK bank who was retained to advise on its restructuring at a monthly salary equivalent to 3.5 times the annual salary of a childcare worker with 20 years of experience. Yet androcentrism is not the only form of cultural imperialism that women in Europe are subject to. Heteronormativity and religious and ethnic forms of imperialism also shape women's lives in Europe. Ask a lesbian woman seeking full expression of her emotions and family wishes. Ask a Roma woman seeking respect for her sexual and reproductive autonomy. Ask a transgender woman seeking legal recognition. Or ask an adult Muslim woman wishing to wear a headscarf when attending university, and they will tell you. So, what has Europe done? And what is the European Union doing about this? Well, Europe, ladies and gentlemen, is at a crucial juncture. Let me explain why. Since its inception, the EU has consistently advocated economic growth and social cohesion. And this concern with socioeconomic inequalities and the ultimate goal of improving people's lives has evolved from the Treaty of Rome through the Lisbon strategy with its economic, social, environmental pillars, to the current Europe 2020 agenda for smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. The pursuit of gender equality, beginning with equal pay in the Treaty of Rome and followed by numerous directives and policy innovations such as gender mainstreaming, has featured strongly in this advancement and was seen as key to the successful implementation of the economic agenda and growth. The goal throughout has been to provide women with equal opportunities in the domains of employment and services, while at the same time protecting them from discriminatory practices as mothers, such as to preserve Europe's traditional commitment since the inception of the welfare state to the protection of the family and motherhood. In particular, since the mid-1990s onwards, under the European Union's European Employment Strategy, formulated in a context where it was assumed that there would be no overall limit on employment opportunities, the promotion of women's employment and gender equality gained a new legitimacy, which pushed all EU member states to improve their parenthood systems and increase childcare services to assist in meeting the goal of higher maternal employment rates. Moreover, beyond economic considerations, both the EU and the Council of Europe, starting at that time to endorse the more ambitious goal of women's empowerment as a fundamental criterion of democracy, echoing the concern expressed at the global level at Beijing's Conference and Platform for Action. The goal in several countries finally became that of parity democracy, a concept coined in Europe. But sadly, analysis of recent EU policy documents with respect to goals and instruments and policy-making environment suggest that attention to gender issues has become much less prominent and less adequate in the preceding decades. This decreasing sense of urgency in European policy is clearly linked to the outbreak of the financial and economic crisis and the austerity measures that have followed them. Unfortunately, the perception of the economic crisis as primarily a crisis for men has meant that gender equality considerations have been absent from policymaking during the crisis. Most countries have witnessed a diminution in gender equality commitments, with the machinery of gender equality policy being either stopped or severely cut back. The implied message seems to be that such policies are at best a distraction in the current crisis. Now, this does not mean zero accomplishment over the last few years. There have indeed been some important milestones, especially in the fight against violence, such as the adoption of the Istanbul Convention to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence in 2011. We must also celebrate at the EU level the Directive on Preventing and Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and the Victims Directive. This said, with the exception of the Framework Agreement on Parental Leave extending the period of parental leave from 3 to 4 months, all other legislative initiatives to advance further in the direction of empowering women and subverting gender roles have failed to pass, including the proposed reforms on maternity leave, working time directive, but also the gender balance on corporate board directive. So, crisis, crisis, austerity, and more crisis. But how have women and gender gaps actually fared in this crisis and under austerity? And what do these facts tell us about future prospects for women in Europe? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have learned 3 things from these times of crisis and austerity. The first thing we've learned is that regardless of the significant fall in both male and female employment at the outbreak of the crisis, women's labor market participation has in fact increased during these years under the so-called added worker effect. Far from quitting the labor market and returning home, to be diligent housewives. Women who lost jobs continued to look for work. More became the sole breadwinners, and some entered the labor market for the first time. A return to the male breadwinner family model simply seems unlikely in advanced economies. It would require the reestablishment of traditional family structures founded on strong family ties, secure male employment, and sufficient family wage jobs, none of which seems to be in the cards. In fact, given aging population, there is a general interest in keeping both men and women on the employment market for longer. The second thing we have learned is that gender inequalities during times of crisis and austerity in employment have somewhat diminished. This, however, is mostly due to the greater job loss and the spread of part-time and flexible forms of employment among men, and the pay freeze, pay cuts, and the overall deterioration of working conditions which have affected all. So, in other words, there has been a process of leveling down that has somewhat closed the gender gap. Finally, we have learned under austerity and fiscal consolidation policies, there has been a contraction of the public sector, a major employer for women, in part because it enables women to be workers and mothers, as well as an overall retreat of the state from social reproduction, which has manifested itself in retrenchment of support for working parents and for the long-term care of the elderly and the disabled. As feminist economist Nancy Folber suggests, this evolution means that gender equality per se is now becoming less critical than trends that have been labeled the pauperization of motherhood and the motherization of poverty, which, needless to say, have a clear disparate impact on women. Here we are. In moving forward, these trends seem to point at two possible scenarios. I would claim that only one of these is compatible with Europe's original self-understanding as committed to gender equality, democracy, and social justice. Let me briefly lay out these two scenarios for you. In the first scenario, current trends towards intensification of neoliberalism and the assumptions that the economy and economic policies are wealth-creating and productive, while social policies are unproductive, constitute a cost, and stunt growth will persist. According to many, under this scenario, we can anticipate a move towards more polarized societies according to class and ethnicity. That is, we can expect an equalization of financial and employment conditions between the lower educated, lower skilled, and migrant women and men, and the widening of gender gaps in the situation and prospects among the higher educated, higher skilled, already the reality in the US today. This situation would lead to increasing inequality between the two groups and the overall leveling down of men's and women's employment position and prospects. At the same time, failure to develop state support for care or reductions in existing provisions may lead to different reactions according to class and gender. Lower educated women may increase time spent on unpaid work or increase their involvement in part-time jobs. Higher educated women may rely more on paid domestic care or more on equal sharing of unpaid work with their partner. In this scenario, let me tell you who the losers will be. Those most in need and care, women from lower social classes, migrant women, young women, and single parents would be the most likely losers. Fertility rates would remain low, and family and gender conservative ideology might still spread in part as a reaction, especially but not exclusively in some of the new member states, which could perhaps cause further rifts within the EU. In a different scenario, the one I'm praying for, the contemporary global economic crisis would be perceived, as many have advocated it should, as an opportunity to diverge from the prevailing neoliberal model of capitalism. A call could be articulated for a more inclusive model of development, which, unlike the traditional position of the left, now integrates a gender perspective and considers the value of activities outside the market, including care. This new emancipatory framework would need to continue to challenge gender stereotypes and predetermined gender roles and integrate economic, environmental, and social reproduction concerns. The equal representation of women in every site of decision-making, that is parity democracy, would be part of the picture, but beyond equal presence of women, this agenda would require the implementation of innovative gender equality policy approaches and tools, such as gender mainstreaming of macroeconomic policy and gender budgeting. Work-life balance policies would be sought as intrinsically good for everyone and not just women. This would require affordable quality childcare, after-school care, and care for other dependents, including the elderly and the differently abled. This would require equal and non-transferable paid leave for women and men. This would require flexible working arrangements, such as job sharing, working from home, flexi-time, and innovative measures to promote equal sharing of work and care, including through tax incentives. To conclude, only in the second scenario can we aspire to close the gender gaps that today still configure the 5 phases of European women's oppression, and to overcome the rigidities of a gender ideology that has hurt so many women and so many men too, in so many ways and for such a long time. Only in the second scenario can we also hope to prevent the overall deterioration of the conditions of the middle and lower classes, and the fear, insecurity, and sense of dispossession that results from it, hitting the young, ladies and gentlemen, an entirely lost generation, particularly hard. For this fear, insecurity, and dispossession can only fuel religious fundamentalisms of the kind that often defines itself precisely around issues of control of women's bodies and sexuality. It can only generate racism, xenophobia, and populism, and with it, a hellish existence for the migrants amidst us. Migrants needed to pay our pensions, to keep up population growth, and to take care of our children and elderly, and a hellish existence for asylum seekers drowning in our waters. Neither will this fear, insecurity, and dispossession encourage European men, including the young, to give up entirely what Rousseau would have called the illusion of the master over the slave, that is, male dominance, as men may perceive gender-based hierarchy to be their last bastion of comfort and a sense of self in a context of emasculation. This means misery for women who will continue to live terrorized in their very homes. And if these forces prevail, ladies and gentlemen, eccellentissime madri, Europe will indeed have lost not only its commitment to equality and justice, but its democratic credentials altogether. So now, more than ever before, is precisely the time for the women question to be raised, and for all those other issues that are strongly connected to it to be addressed. And this, the Salone del Cinquecento, is precisely the place to do so. For this Salone was built in 1494 after one of the expulsions of the Medici family from Florence. Florence, the cradle of Renaissance and its humanism, a movement which sought to defeat multiple forms of medieval dogmatism. Much the same in the present, if we are truly to confront and address the woman question, it may require the displacement of dogmatisms around unregulated global financial markets, austere neoliberal states, and the self-sufficiency of human beings. It may require the rescue, just as the Renaissance did, of the individual man and indeed the individual woman too, from different forms of tyrannies and their modern iterations. Thank you very much for your attention.
We will now begin with our morning session, Women and Conflict. Jennifer Welch, Professor in International Relations at the European University Institute, will chair the session. Our distinguished participants include Valerie Amos, Director of SOAS, and former Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator for the United Nations. Monica Maggioni, President of RAI, Italy's national public broadcasting company, and Patricia Sellers, Special Advisor for Prosecution Strategies to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Please welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good morning. I have to say, this is a very hard act to follow. Ruth, thank you so much for that address. But I'm pleased to say I do think with this panel, this distinguished panel, we can certainly try to follow that act. I'm going to very briefly try to give you the rationale for why we wanted to bring together a distinguished panel like this. In my field in political science about 15 years ago, it was fashionable to try to paint the world in two camps: a zone of peace and a zone of war and conflict. And 15 years ago or more, I had difficulty with that dichotomy. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I have even more difficulty with it today. And I think There's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, that conflict is not history in Europe. Conflict is within Europe and within the European neighborhood today, particularly if we think of Ukraine. But also, European states are participating in modern armed conflicts. If we think about the air campaign over Syria and Iraq, for example. And of course, we are feeling the effects of armed conflict, as Ruth has suggested and others have suggested. But also, and this is something I think some of our panelists will allude to, European states are part of an international community that has signed, ratified, and claimed to be dedicated to rules and norms designed to ameliorate armed conflict. Now, the inspiration for this panel really came from the Security Council's resolution in 2000, Resolution 1325, as it's known, on women in peace and security, where the Council and its members declared that women are affected differently by conflict in different ways, but also that women have incredible roles to play in the resolution of conflict and in peace building. And we discussed some of that yesterday at the Badia. But also I want to throw out another element, and that is that women are participants in conflict as combatants, as foreign fighters, as we know, also as providers of humanitarian relief, but also as journalists, as one of our distinguished panelists will describe. So I have a truly blue ribbon panel to discuss these issues. Firstly with Baroness Amos, who is the director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, but who also for 5 years was at the heart of the United Nations efforts to bring humanitarian and emergency relief, at the center of discussions of international peace and security. And of course, Monica Majoni, our second speaker, president of RAI, but also a distinguished career in broadcasting, covering Operation Iraqi Freedom, the bombing of the World Trade Center, and other such momentous events. And lastly, Patricia Sellers, who is a criminal investigator, lawyer, but also through her work with the International Criminal Court, at the center of efforts to rethink what justice means in the aftermath of conflict, justice for women. So I have the honor to begin this discussion with a few questions for each of the panelists, and then I will open it up to you for your questions. So let me begin with Valerie Amos. And Valerie, I'd like to ask you to start our discussion how, in your experience, you perceive contemporary conflicts, particularly those within which you were actively involved, Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, are affecting civilians and women in particular.
Thank you, Jennifer. And first of all, to say how pleased I am to be here when we're discussing such critical issues, not just for Europe, but for the world. And in terms of crises like Syria and Yemen, I think the first thing I would say is that the way in which these conflicts have been politicized has had a significant impact, not just on the ability to try to find a solution to those crises, but on the way that humanitarian work, for example, is able to be done in those conflict zones. What do I mean by that? These are conflicts where you have permanent members of the Security Council that have a very clear side. So it was very tough when I was at the United Nations, for example. It took us years to get the first humanitarian resolution on Syria. And if you think about what happened a few days ago when the Security Council finally agreed a resolution on the protection of health facilities, I mean, this is something that should be non-negotiable. And yet it has taken years, despite what we have in international humanitarian law, for this to be agreed. So the context in which these conflicts are being waged, I think, is having a significant impact on women, on children, on communities in general, and we need to recognize that. Because the issues around accountability and impunity are at the heart of what these conflicts are about. So how do they particularly impact on women? Of course, there is the huge displacement, and 80% of those who flee, and they have fled several times within the country before they leave and go to neighboring countries and further afield, are women with their children. The huge impact of sexual violence on women and girls, and the complete inability to actually manage, in any way, manage that, and to really protect women and girls from that violence. That is not to say that men don't face that violence too. We saw it in Syria, particularly with those prisons and the men that were in those prisons, but overwhelmingly the violence is against women and girls. And then the degradation of facilities like health facilities, education facilities, the destruction of communities, those no-go areas, parts of Syria where humanitarian organizations have been unable to get to for months, for years. Again, an overwhelming impact on women with their children as they actually try to hold communities together. Famine and starvation being used as a weapon of war. The situation is absolutely appalling, and I have to say, although it's now 8 months since I left the UN, I still feel that as a world we should be ashamed of the way that we have watched this conflict unravel.
Thank you. And I wonder, just in the context of talking about Syria, from my impression, particularly through the use of aerial bombardment, you know, what we're seeing in Syria in particular, but also in parts of Iraq, is urban warfare again. And I wonder, from your perspective, thinking about how this affects women in particular, not just in terms of targeting, but how they have to cope on a daily basis with war in their neighborhoods.
Yes, the absolute total destruction of those neighborhoods. I remember the first time I went to Syria, which was about a year into the conflict, trying to persuade the Syrian government that actually they had a serious humanitarian crisis on their hands. At that time, I think it was about 1 million people who were in need of humanitarian assistance. That figure now stands at some 12 million inside the country, and of course there are the millions who have left. But I went into a neighborhood of Homs, Baba Amma. I was the first person to go into that neighborhood as the tanks rolled out. I literally saw the last tank rolling out, the last government tank rolling out as I went in. And the devastation was, it was appalling to see, actually. There was not a single building left standing. And those that were not safe. So the communities had left, people were foraging for what they could find, and this has been replicated across the towns and cities of Syria. And it is, of course, the women who are trying to hold it together. And you know, most recently we've seen those appalling pictures in Aleppo, but this is not just Aleppo. And those areas that have been described as you know, hard to access, difficult to get to, let us not pretend these are places where week after week, month after month, it has been impossible to get humanitarian aid in, but people have not been let out, even to get health, access to a doctor. So women have borne the brunt of that because they have watched what has happened to their children. And let's not forget, daily life does go on. Women, they have children. I mean, where are the facilities in which they can give birth safely. They have children that they want to get to school. They cannot find food. I mean, this is having a disproportionate impact on women. And you talked about the role that women themselves play in these kinds of conflicts. I was very struck the first time I went to Turkey to a refugee camp, again, that the women were talking about the fact that the world had abandoned them and the role that they wanted to play in directly fighting for their freedom. They were angry, they were concerned, they knew they had a role to keep their children safe and to try to hold their families and communities together, but actually they also wanted to go and fight.
Interesting. I wanted to just have you comment as well on another aspect in which we can think perhaps in a more positive light about the role of women. One of the key aspects of the Resolution 1325 was about trying to increase, in a very concrete way, the participation of women in mediation, in conflict resolution, and in peace building. And as you probably know, actual quantitative targets were set. You know, there should be so many peace processes that should have women as part of them. And I wonder, from your experience, Valerie, how do you think the role of women in mediation, conflict resolution, and peace building can be enhanced? Because we're still nowhere near meeting those goals.
We're nowhere near meeting those goals, and I have a concern that we constantly talk about the fact that we consult women, which is very different to women's actual active engagement in these processes. So let's just be clear, consultation is not active engagement. So, you know, I worked in the United Nations for 5 years. I care about it deeply. I care about multilateral organizations. I think it's important that they're there. But we cannot pretend that the fact that, you know, if there is a peace negotiation going on, that we have some kind of, you know, fringe consultation with a number of women's organizations is about active engagement in prevention or in a peace process. So let's just get our language right, but let's also just get a proper understanding of what active engagement actually means. And I think that there is a tension here because, of course, it makes a difference if women are engaged and involved. But it doesn't always mean that women are going to play a positive role. So let's remember that as well. But I think the reality of, as it were, the fights, the disputes, the differences that have to be put on the table, women have to be as actively engaged in that as men do. And I've been watching what's been happening with the discussions on Yemen, for example. Now, when Yemen had those consultations on the new constitution for women, for the country, women played a very active role in that. And it's been very distressing to me to see those talks ongoing in Kuwait without really seeing concerted engagement with Yemeni women. The same in the talks on Syria, although there are one or two women who are actively engaged in the opposition. So I think we need to change the whole way that we think about this, and we have to put a lot more pressure, not just on the governments who are on one side of this, but on these non-state armed groups. And this is one of the challenges that we have a system, a multilateral system, which is all about governments, and conflict situations, which are all about non-state armed groups actually fighting those governments. And we still haven't found a way of resolving that and ensuring that we are talking to the non-state armed groups and ensuring that women aren't just oppressed and violated within those non-state armed groups.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to a couple of those themes. Monica, if I may, can I turn to you and first, I guess, ask you from your experience, particularly in conflict zones, what do you think are some of the major misconceptions we have in the wider world about women in conflict? either as victims or as contributors?
I do think there are many of them, but let me just first thank you and this great opportunity we have here to stay together and try to reflect a little bit on the kind of things that normally are not in the headlines, because what's in the headlines, it's just something which happened yesterday or the day before. But what's behind the events, that's not in the headlines. So I do think it's a great opportunity being here and discussing what's behind the headlines. And the role of women is one of those things that are behind the headlines, but it's key. Valerie was telling us the situation in Syria. I've been through that several times as well in these years. And really, again, if I think of Syria, of Iraq, of what I've seen, what I've gone through in these last 15 years, I've seen women playing roles that nobody can imagine here when you look just at the bigger picture of a war. Women in war have so many different roles. Yes, they are victims on a personal level, for sure, but they always have a bigger burden on their shoulders because they are normally interested not just in saving themselves, but a family, a community, an organization. They have a wider sight on what's going on. And again, endurance, resistance, resilience. We look at the women as weak. Yes, for sure, for many reasons. They are the weakest link of the chain. But what we see every single day in war areas is that they have an incredible resilience and incredible capacity of reacting to what happens. Valerie was talking about Syria, and my mind was going back to Iraq. I've been living there for 3 years, and I do remember that in 2004, I don't know how many of you remember that season of the bombings. It meant living in Baghdad. It meant waking up every single day, every single morning, with a bomb exploding somewhere in town. And if you moved to the center of the town, you couldn't see a person going around. Yes, some men here and there, more trying to, collect and stay together for a few minutes, but that's it. No sign of normal life. Then you moved to the market. In the market, what you could see was just women trying to sell something, buy something, trying to cope with everyday's life, with trying to struggle to give a little chance of life to their own families. That was a great part of the struggle, but there was no media interested in portraying this part of the war that was taking place every single day there. And then, again, a few months after, January 2005, the first attempt of elections in Baghdad. What I do remember was the joy and the happiness of those women with this violet finger, because it was a sign that they voted there, and they wanted to participate. And I was so impressed by the fact that we tend to look at Arab women through the lenses of our stereotypes. Okay, that day, what I've seen, what I was witnessing was the fact that those women wanted to be part of the reconstruction. Even, those days, and it was 2005, unfortunately, we forgot all of them for such a long time, until the very day that a man called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi decided to make the headlines again. What happened in between is our fault. We have to remember that. The fact that we considered always, very not relevant to our everyday's life, what was taking place in those areas, in those years, is a part of what's happening today. And those women there were people waiting for us to stay, to help building, and we moved somewhere else. So women with this, very different role to play. And you were mentioning, Jennifer, the fact that now they are actors. Yes, it's happening more and more. Unfortunately, We see every single day stories of some girl deciding to leave even from Europe and go fighting with Daesh. And that's a part of it. That's part of a struggle. And I do think that we don't have to dismiss this phenomenon. I do think that we have to look deeply into this phenomenon and try to understand the roots and the reasons. If not, we're going to fight even bigger effects of all this. And the last part of this is women in war as witnesses. I've been there for such a long time trying to witness what I was seeing every single day. And there is where the stereotype is bigger. Let me just be provocative. Being a female war correspondent is much easier than being a male war correspondent. What do I mean? I mean that you're so much more motivated, that you want to look all the angles of reality. You're not just looking for something specific and this is it. And this gives you an incredible chance to understand more, to go through the reality, to go through the different and complicated situations, and to meet people, to meet so many people and women that you would never meet in your life. So I do think it's a privilege and not a problem.
Thank you. Can I just follow up briefly, Monica, on your discussion of European women being recruited or enticed? Because I know you're also following very closely social media and Twitter and the use by Daesh of this medium. Have you observed any particular strategies that they're using to try to entice women through this media?
What I do see is a combination of factors. On one hand, you see the fact that they use towards young girls the same techniques that they use towards boys, just to recruit them. So they look for a personality that wants to be in the middle of the scene, and they're not. And so they give them the chance to be the hero or the leader of a story which, you know, it doesn't matter if it's a negative or a positive one. It's being the hero of a story. It's being the hero of a movie. And so this is a part of it. But on another hand, you have this young girl and women that feels to be part of a network, and they build all those parts of this network that helps the other to act. I do think that we have to speculate a lot about the role that women played in the last attacks, even in Europe, because this idea that there is a society that covers you in some ways goes very much through women. It's what happens with the phenomenon of mafia, where women contribute to cover many situations. And so I do think that we, as women, have to work a lot on this, have to understand much more, have to go through these communities and talk to the girls of these communities and try to understand what kind of dynamics are taking place these days. Because we have to go through a more complex way, a more complex approach to this kind of phenomenon.
Thank you. Let me just round off this first round, if you will, by bringing in Patricia, because Patricia has done a lot of work in the post-conflict phase, thinking about what we do to redress the harms that have been done in the course of conflict. And so if I can just begin, Patricia, and ask you, how do you think that women and women's experiences in war and how post-conflict processes have tried to address them have changed the way we think about what justice is?
Right. Well, let me speak about the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, not the International Criminal Court. And it goes back to the point of women's experiences at war being different. There were two landmark cases, and I will say landmark. One was the Forunzia case, and the other was the case about a city called Foča, but is formally called the Prosecutor versus Kunovac. The Forunzia case was a case where the events took place during a period of a week and a half And it was really the story of a woman who had been trying to protect her sons, lived in a building, had to go down into the basement of the building to avoid bombing, to avoid her sons being, in quotes, kidnapped, recruited by what were Bosnian Croat forces. 2 days later, she was picked up because she was going to be interrogated at the paramilitary headquarters that wasn't far from her. They took her to the headquarters, but not to the office. They took her to the barracks. And in the barracks, they said, the boss will come and interrogate you. In order to be interrogated, she had to take all of her clothes off, had to be threatened with a knife that might mutilate her sexual organs, her vagina. The boss came, interrogated her, and then didn't believe her, so he left. When he left the militia there with her, and so one of the militiamen decided to rape her in 3 different ways, orally, vaginally, anally. And then the boss came back and confronted her with another person. And while he continued the interrogation, while she was being confronted, she was continued to be sexually raped. That was the case. It was a case of war crimes. It wasn't about charging over the hill. It wasn't about the depth of the crater for the mortar. It was about what happened in the life of that woman 1 week during a war. And from there, we get rulings that look at sexual violence of rape as torture, that reconfirms rape as a war crime. The other case, the Focia case, looked at a series of females, and I have to say females and not women because sometimes I'm talking about girls, and sometimes I'm talking about adult females or women. And this case looked at a group of 50 women over a period of a little bit under 6 months that went from being the women who were holding their houses down together because the men had tried to escape so they wouldn't be part of the war, who were sleeping in the woods at night, who were finally arrested, placed in several detention centers, and were awaiting deportation, which is very gendered during a war. Women are sent out one way, men are sent out imprisoned or killed another way. Some of the women were deported. Other women were placed in subsequent houses. And then finally, some of the subgroup of the women in subsequent houses, those females, were placed or sold to rotating soldiers and sexually violated to the extent that was forms of enslavement. And some of the girls were able to escape their enslavement because they were traded for a TV set or 500 Deutsche Marks. So the experiences of women at war on European soil has even changed our notion of what we think justice should be at international courts and tribunals, or even in truth and reconciliation, if we don't address that injustice that came to us through the point of view of women at war. We now understand that our justice is not only impartial, but it's imperfect. And I think that we can't underestimate this contribution that women have given to our sense of civility during the past 25 years.
Thank you. I want to address a sort of delicate question and get your take on it, because it's often said that when feminism applies itself to an issue, it, by definition, narrows our perspective on that issue. It brings one part of our gaze and focuses on just women or women's experience. And do you think the feminist perspective has done this with respect to conflict and its aftermath? Has it narrowed our focus too much?
Well, I think personally, being a feminist and looking at international criminal law, or one could look at humanitarian law, has actually opened up aperture. It's opened up our gaze. First, we might have said, oh, we're looking at sexually violated women. Then we realized sometimes we're looking at girls. And then we really realized that we were looking at a genderism. We were looking at what happened to the boys, what happened to the men who are adults, what happened to the girls, what happened to the women. And then you could not ask the question, well, what happened to the community? How did this affect the community? How does this affect whether people stay in their houses or, in the situation, again in Europe of Kosovo, that you self-deport? We started understanding that attacking the civilian population, which is a war crime, it's a customary war crime, and you ask yourself, well, how can the civilian population be attacked? And via the Kosovo experience and recent appellate jurisprudence at the Yugoslav Tribunal, we realized that the civilian population can be attacked via sexual terrorization. People would move their families so that their boys or that their girls are not sexually terrorized. And so we might have seen that feminism looked as if it were only concerned with a very narrow range of issues. And what it did was just give us a different way to approach broader issues. But what became much more important is that it made us look at the underlying doctrines of humanitarian law and international criminal law. And we have a broader understanding of them, and I think one that's deeper and one that safeguards us much better than before.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I absolutely agree with that. I think it is about a broadening, but I think it's also how you then take those concepts and operationalize them. And I think it's in the operationalizing of them that the gaze has become narrower. So that's where I think the problem lies. Humanitarian action, which is what I know most about, for example, there's a huge tension between how do you do what humanitarian action is supposed to do, which is immediate relief, but also recognize the differences between people. So the actions that are taken are quite kind of narrow. So it's in a refugee camp. It's about, we get a separate toilet, we get a few guards, and it's never enough. So this issue, which is about how do you protect the most vulnerable and how do you recognize the particular protections that, for example, women and girls need in a particular situation. And the resources are never there to really help us to do that. So if you look at a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the recognition that came after years about the systematic use of rape and sexual exploitation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, then peacekeepers were meant to protect. But there were never enough peacekeepers to do that, and there wasn't a growing understanding and attention paid to the security forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo to play their part in that protection. So I think it's in the application of what we as feminists have been able to identify and the action that's taken on the ground. That's where I think the narrowing comes. Because I think if you think about what Ruth said in her introduction and the 5 phases of oppression, they're as applicable in a situation in a country in the European Union as they are in a conflict country. So it's not about the lens and the gaze, because I think the connections are being made at the level of the feminist gaze on the law or the feminist gaze on the policy, but it's about what we do about it, where I think we have become quite narrow, or where we are, not become, we are quite narrow.
Well, I'd now like to turn it over to the audience. If there are questions that you're saving up for any of our panelists, I want to come back with a few questions of my own, but let's open up the discussion a little bit. There's roaming microphones. You can indicate who you'd like to answer the question, or you can ask everyone to comment if it's a broader question. I see Heather Grabe first. Raise your hand very high if you want to ask your question, because it's hard for me to see.
Yeah. Thank you. Heather Grabe from the Robert Schuman Centre at the UI. I'd like to ask the panel about the role of women in conflict resolution and peace building. I'm very much struck by the example of Northern Ireland, where several groups of mothers on both sides of the sectarian divide in the end put forward a very clear demand for a peace process, which seemed to change the political dynamics at a crucial point. And I've heard of other examples like this, from East Timor to also Sri Lanka. So I really wanted to go back to some of the points that Ruth was making and also Valerie Amos at the beginning about the role of mothers in communities and the way that they might think of the interests of the community in a way that can help to overcome essentially the dynamic cycle of violence which tends to set in, both in economic terms but also political terms. I'm curious for your views on how often can that happen, and does it depend on a critical moment, or is it something that can actually be encouraged and even built within communities where conflict has become a cycle that seems to be unbreakable? Thank you.
So just to make sure that you heard the question. So the question is about women's role in conflict resolution. What are the opportunities for them to play that role given their guardians, their role in the community, and does there have to be a special moment which can galvanize that, or are there broader opportunities for them to play a constructive role? Do you want to go first, Valerie?
Well, I think it can happen anywhere. And timing is important, but I think one of the crucial things is about being able to work across whatever divide exists in that conflict. So in Northern Ireland, it was across a religious divide. I saw this in Central African Republic, where women in communities were coming together and making demands, but it was women across the divide. So I think it doesn't work if it's just women from one particular community or one side. It has to be a strong voice that is a collective voice, where the women have acknowledged their differences, but actually say, peace is more important than those differences, and then they are able to use that as a springboard to exercise power and influence. But the timing is also critical, because if you are in the midst of a conflict where one side still thinks it's going to win and are putting all of their resources into that, it's not going to work. So women can work behind the scenes to be ready, but the timing is crucial as well.
Monica, do you want to come in on that point?
Yes, I totally agree with Valerie about the timing, which is crucial, and I'll be back on this in a few seconds. But let me also tell you that when I witness, women working together, especially when it comes to women coming from different parts of the communities. I've seen Shia and Sunni women in Iraq doing what it was impossible on any other level. And they were those who said, there's a basis to work on this. And so this is why it's so important to have them involved, not consulted. Again, not consulted, but, operationally involved. And I was struck a few days ago looking at this study of the Foreign Affairs Committee of US Chambers of Deputies that said that the agreement of a peace negotiation in which women are involved has 35% more likely to last on the period of a sustainable period of 15 years, which means you're working on a stronger basis. But let me also add another element to what you were talking about. We have on one hand the conflict resolution, but we also have to manage the most difficult situation during the conflict. Valerie was talking about refugee camps. Refugee camps is one of those situations in which international organizations need to work with women, because women there are victims in the refugee camps. We know exactly that there are so many situations in which women are abused or raped, especially young girls, but exactly for this, there should be a pivotal point to work with. You should start working in these refugee camps with them, because in refugee camps, you build the chance of a future peace, because those are the people that hopefully will one day go back, and their attitude will be key to build a sustainable peace process.
Would you like to come in on this?
Brief observation, and one can see in the latest peace negotiations that have occurred between the FARC and the Colombian government that women's voices were brought in far too late. They formed a subcommittee related to gender, but the negotiations were 90% done. So they had some input, But the input was late, and you could understand that since women weren't allowed to describe what had harmed them during this 45-year conflict, it didn't become a priority of what we had to address. And so there is a lot of catching up that's done. And the other thing I would like to say in terms of timing, women are always disempowered because cessation of hostilities usually deals with two types of armed forces, a national one or a non-state actor. When women come to the table, the question is always asked a little ingenious, well, who are you representing? What armed group are you representing? You have no power to stop the hostility because you're not a fighter, which really disempowers the pacifist, disempowers the community builder. So we have to be very careful of the questions that we ask as qualifications to come to the peace table.
Great. There was another question here, Cynthia.
Hi, thank you very much. Cynthia Milton, Canada Research Chair in Latin American History at the University of Montreal, and Fernand Bordeaux, Fellow at the European University Institute. So my question is regarding the incorporation of women in capacity positions in resolution processes, as well as in just general humanitarian projects. Is there a distinction that we can be made between state-led initiatives and non-governmental organizations? From my research into Latin America, it seems to me that non-governmental organizations tend to bring women in very constructive, beyond consultative roles earlier on in the projects compared relatively to state. And this would also play out in your remark about the FARC and in Colombia bringing in women so late. At the NGO levels, women have been beyond consultation and actually active participants in non-governmental organizations and peace process movements from the very beginning. But when it becomes a state-led project, then they're brought in late, and they're brought in specifically to address questions of gender. Thank you.
Who would like to start on that question? In terms of NGOs.
I'll go again. I think there are several strands to this. I think the first strand is a strand that I am extremely concerned about, which is the very negative way in which sovereignty is used very often by states that want to say that they have the power, they have the influence, they should be the key party in any negotiations. And we've seen this in the Syria talks, and we've seen it elsewhere. And in many of those situations, women are not a part of those discussions. The second thing I'd mention is that in a number of those states, and I've seen it in South Sudan, in Syria and elsewhere, where the role that non-governmental or civil society organizations are playing is essentially dismissed or downgraded, and they do have a lot of women who are involved in those because of what the state says, what the government says is that, you know, who are these people, where is the accountability, to come to the point, you know, who do you represent? So you are dismissed in that sense as well. And then there is a third layer of this, which I think is about the local and the way in international debate and discussion we actually treat local actors, and particularly local women, who are not part of a fighting force. Again, the point that was made, that somehow we internationalize the stage at which we talk about a peace process rather than localize it. And there's continually a tension between those two things. And I don't think that we have resolved it. And very often the resolution is that you have some kind of meeting of women in civil society, which is external, it's not central to the process itself.
Monica, would you like to jump in?
Let me answer so briefly. It's a matter of power, again, and it's the mirror of what happens in society. So the official negotiator, the state negotiators are considered much more powerful, state level, which is man. And NGOs are perceived as much more, working in society, which is okay with women. So things are changing, yes, not all at the same time and not everywhere. So I do think that we're witnessing a process even in this, as in the rest of society.
Patricia.
Yeah, very briefly, I think there is one way that we can think beyond this. And why do we not have citizen participation in peace processes? I mean, there's been discussion in terms of victim participation in international crimes. The third party, partie civile, which is part of a lot of the legal traditions here in Europe. When we think of females as citizens of the country that is affected, and think of citizen participation, then there should be no contradiction. And even the heads of states should be speaking on behalf of their citizens, of whom females will be the majority. So really there should not only be no contradiction, there should be a lot of enthusiastic input from females, because the peace will be built in basically a gendered society of where females are the majority. So I think we even have to try and stop thinking about the female participation as unrelated to citizenship, as being a minority voice, as opposed to looking at this truth of majority, legitimate political voice.
Just before I take the next question, from my own observation in terms of looking at how conflicts have been resolved, we typically think about the resolution of a conflict as being a power sharing agreement. And in that very phrase, power sharing, you are bringing certain holders of power to the table. And I think there's an interesting opportunity over the next decade when we look at the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that have recently been reached by states. In a time of great political turmoil in the world, we actually had agreement on Sustainable Development Goals. And so what is sustainable peace in the 21st century? Is it about a temporary power sharing model, or is it about a much more robust, society-wide embracing of peace building? And I think there is a real opportunity for research in this area, but also for some of these perspectives to come to bear. I have a question right here, woman in the black dress with a scarf, and then at the very back.
Yes, thank you very much for your excellent presentation, very interesting. I'm Camilla Landini, I'm a gender specialist, former SOAS student and UN staff. I have just a question for all of you. I totally agree with Monica Maggioni when she said that the women correspondents, they have a real comparative advantage. And I would like to point out that also humanitarian workers, women humanitarian workers, I've seen it without undermining, a man and what they do in the field. I just would like to refer to the Council of Europe work in the field of women and media, and they have highlighted the important role that the women play. And so I would like to ask, do you think that media institutions are at this stage are recognizing this comparative advantage that women journalists have, or do you think that also institution? I refer also to institution. Do you think that we talk a lot, but then institution and society is not really recognizing that?
Thank you.
I didn't hear that much.
So the question was a little bit of a difficulty hearing, but the question was about the comparative advantage.
Just technical, because we can't hear that well.
The end, yeah.
Well, I said I agree with what you said, that women journalists, correspondent, humanitarian workers, they have a comparative advantage. Do you think that institutions, media institutions, are agreeing with them? Do they recognize that? Do you think that they're ready for that, or do you think there is still a path to?
Thank you.
If I get the question correctly, my point is it's not much a matter of recognition. Things are really changing, even in the media. And so it's so true that so many women live and go and cover conflict or cover any other topic. And they have a career because of that or not? Yes. So I'm quite confident on the fact that things are really evolving in the media, and I do think that my provocative answer before was exactly about this, not looking at the media as such a place in which being a war correspondent is that different from being a man war correspondent. So I really think that in this evolution, that's not a problem anymore, not that much. I do think that we have to focus much more on societies and on the way we approach wider themes. I mean, media is one of those areas in which women had the chance to progress quite a lot. Yes, we're not at the end of the process, but we're almost there. So I think it's really possible for a woman today in the media go to a conflict, cover a conflict, be recognized as a person who has this capacity and not being discriminated in a way. So I do think that, I mean, at least we have a little part, a very little part of it which has been solved. Now we have the reality to fix, which is much more complex.
Thank you. A question at the very back. She's standing waiting for a microphone. And then I have a question here. Sorry for the lag.
Thank you very much, Marina Carloni. You are alumna and professor at the University of Milano Bicocca. What I'm seeing at the global level is increasing number of young women who are victims of war, who are becoming symbol of girls' and women's human rights against any form of violence, but also in defense of their minority, of their population. I organized 2 days ago in Milan an encounter with Nadia Murad, who is a young lady, 21 years old, belonging to the Yazidi community, which is a religious minority in Iraq. And she was kidnapped, raped by several men, made a sexual slave. Then she was able to escape. Now she has become the leader of her population, and she's struggling. So I'm wondering whether there are special programs just to support these young witnesses who are fighting for their population, for their minority, for women in general, and for girls victims of sexual abuse and war. Thank you.
Valerie, do you want to come in on that question?
On the matter of whether there are special programs, I'm not aware of special programs, and I think this is something that we really need to address. Because one of the things that concerns me is that we have a system that was established a very long time ago to deal with with conflicts and a set of situations that are very, very different now. They have different aspects. The way that they are played out with young people is very, very different. The whole social media backdrop, I mean, everything has changed. And our institutions and our frameworks have not changed. They have evolved. There is some reform, but it's not fast enough. And I think that we need to have, we need to involve those young women, but not just young women, young people, in all the debates and discussions about how we take this forward, how we can support them, how we can better protect them, how we can help them to be the advocates that they want to be when they do escape these kinds of situations, how we protect them before so that they do not become victims. I do think that one of the things that's deeply worrying is the way that societies that were secular have now become a kind of hotbed of religious persecution, for example. And then communities particular communities are supported, but we have moved away from the secular base that was so important in terms of the balance in those societies. So we need to look both at the backdrop and the societal implications as well as the individual implications for those young people. But Patricia may know more about whether there are particular programs.
Patricia.
As a matter of fact, I don't know about any programs, and it's a shame that that's not common knowledge or specialized knowledge. I mean, for example, there is no trust fund for war victims. That's just a general trust fund for anyone who had the absolute courage to escape from being enslaved from a Yazidi. There should be definitely a European-wide, if not a UN-wide trust fund just per se for those heroes, those persons who are able to survive. And we should have much more robust ability to use universal jurisdiction to try and offer a form of legal justice in addition to social and economic justice for persons like that. And that is up for the individual states. There are certain countries at this point in time and certain civil society groups that are trying to say, how could we ever address the situations in northern Iraq? They fall outside of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Would that mean that a separate ad hoc tribunal, such as in the case of Rwanda, be set up, or a hybrid tribunal, such as in the case of Sierra Leone? These discussions are extremely limited, circumscribed, do not have necessarily a lot of political support. And in the meantime, persons who are victims/survivors look to a community who appear not to resonate with their pain or their injustice.
Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. There was a gentleman in the third, sorry, I can see you better now. Not a gentleman, a woman in black.
Yes, hello. My name is Maria Röstelhumer. I'm from Austria. I'm the manager of the Women's Network on Violence Against Women in Europe, WAVE. And I would like to say that it's very important, the question in which way we could support women in conflict areas from abroad. Because I think, I know that so many women are in a very isolated situation. And in 2014, we have had a conference in Vienna where we invited women activists from Ukraine and ex-Yugoslavia. And we also asked them, what would you help in your situation, or what was the experience in ex-Yugoslavia regarding the situation? And the women say the most important thing is to have the feeling, a solidarity from outside. Women from outside, they are solid. There's a solidarity, and there are maybe pediatricians who support them, or they try to get financial support for them, and create a alliance together with the women in this field. And I think we shouldn't forget the solidarity. There is a very important thing in this situation.
Thanks. I'm going to just add to that question a little bit for the panel and ask, from your experience in speaking to women in conflict zones or in post-conflict situations, what do they say they most want from the outside world in terms of support or the kinds of things that the questioner was getting at? Monica.
To me, this word solidarity is key, because women are very empathic and they feel empathy with the rest of the world, and the fact that sometimes we have conflicts that are completely forgotten in our mainstream speech. It's a problem, it's a big problem. But also let me add another element that I was thinking of before, because it was one of the requests that I heard most of the time from women in conflict, and it's their concern about education, about the lack of education that every conflict brings with itself. Women are those who are very much aware of the impact that this lack of education, imagine those people that stay 2, 3, 4 years in the refugee camp and lose a complete school cycle. Women know that through education you build a future or you destroy a future, and they ask for this continuity because they understand that only through education they can have a chance to have their community in place once again after the conflict is gone. But this kind of awareness, I've always found it through women and very rarely in a man conversation, this focus on education.
Valerie.
I completely agree with those 2 points. I think the solidarity point is key. The first thing I used to be asked when talking to women in refugee camps, displaced in communities in towns and cities, they would always say, why has the world abandoned us? So that important link and a recognition of the situation that they're in was key. 2, education, because they're so worried about the future for their children and for their communities. The third is communication too. They want to know what is happening to their communities back home, what's happening to their husbands, their sons, but also maybe their mothers and others that they have left behind. And the fourth is something about a degree of economic freedom, actually being able to in some way work to help your family and community wherever you are. And I was always struck in a refugee camp or going to visit large numbers of displaced people, way out in South Sudan, that very often the first thing that women did, and I saw this outside their tents in refugee camps, for example, they would be selling things. So, because they would want a little bit of cash, because they knew what their family needed. So they would start by selling something outside their tent, then it would be, they would expand it to, the whole refugee camp. I went to visit a hospital in South Sudan which had been taken over. It became the place for people who had fled horrendous violence. And the first thing they did was establish a sort of little market street. So this sense of having some sense of economic freedom is also crucial.
Patricia.
Just very briefly, I mean, you remind me when I speak to persons I would interview to be potential witnesses, that women right away were speaking about other people, not necessarily themselves. They were finding a way to rebuild the community immediately, in essence. Their inability to speak about themselves was always, look, what happened to me wasn't that important, but you should know about this, this, this. And not being able to situate themselves in the midst of the political or the military horror. But I think one thing that women, in expressing this need for community, are really showing that our human dignity lies in our relations to others. And so this question of solidarity is somewhere, see me as the human being I am. Don't see me as a destroyed person. Do you see my humanness again? And I think that's the greatest solidarity that we can construct with people in order to rebuild communities, in essence, rebuild our own international community ourselves.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, but I have one more question for the panelists. And I would like each of them very briefly to address. One of the key aspects of Security Council Resolution 1325 was to call on the international community to increase the participation of women in peace and security institutions. And to a certain extent, that has happened within the United Nations. It has certainly happened within the European Union, as we know, with the High Representative, who has twice now been female. But we have, over the next 5 months, a process which will see the selection of the next Secretary General of the UN. And as you know, there's much discussion about that this should be a woman. And I just wonder from the panel, the critique of that approach is to say that's symbolism. It won't have real effect. And I wonder what your perspective is on what difference that would make if this next Secretary General was a woman, leading at the central leadership of the world's main institution for thinking about peace and security and conflict resolution. And maybe I'll go in reverse order since Patricia.
Right. I think if we had a female as the Secretary General of the United Nations, certainly there would be a visual symbolic effect. I mean, just as being American and having had an African-American president allowed a visual symbolic effect as well as the person. But I'm much more concerned that we have a gender competent person as the next Secretary General. And I mean someone who's not gender sensitive in that, oh, let's be sensitive. I mean, you're never army sensitive, you're never, let's be sensitive about the economy. I want you to be gender competent, to understand the wealth and resources that females bring to our nations and our communities.
Monica.
I totally agree with Valeria's point, but I also like to say that it would be a symbol, yes, first of all, because it means it's normal. There are positions, there are men and women, and it can be one or the other. That's the day we have to point at, the very day in which it doesn't matter, it's a man or a woman. It's someone who's able to do the job, has all the, you know, what is needed to fit and to do what you need to do in that place. So I'm waiting for that.
Valerie.
Well, the first thing I would say is that let's not underestimate the power of symbolism. I think symbolism is really important. And I think it's only a problem if you appoint a woman who's not competent. And don't tell me there aren't women in the running who aren't competent and able to do the job. Yeah. So, you know, the excuse always is, you know, it's about the skills that you need. Yes, it's about the skills that you need, but it's 2016 and we have women with the skills. So there is no excuse.
So we make the decision and it's done.
Thank you. You answered that in the way I hoped you would. And it's been a very stimulating discussion for me, I hope for the audience. A wonderful follow-on to Ruth's address. And I just would like to ask all of you in this marvelous hall to join me in thanking our three panelists this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You did a great job.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to continue. One of the things that characterizes all our State of the Union events in recent years has been trying to find a balance between being proactive and reactive. We are proactive when we try to impose on the discussion of the State of the Union a theme, an agenda item, which is not the subject of the morning news. And I think you will agree with me that this year and last year with our survey project, and this year with Women in Union and the World, we have been most successful in imposing this kind of agenda item. At the same time, we also try to respond to actuality by bringing in interesting, different, and challenging points of view. And we decided this year that one of the most pressing issues on the European Union agenda is in the field of foreign relations, and in particular, the relationship between the European Union and Russia. It's our pleasure and our honor to welcome today Dr. Andrei Furchenko, who's a former Minister of Education of Russia, and for the last 2 years a special aide to President Putin. And he will speak with a tantalizing and provocative title, Europe and Russia, Partnership versus Brinkmanship. And after he finishes, we will have a short discussion with him relating to this and other issues. Dr. Furchenko, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Professor Willer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Willer asked me to be a little provocative in this speech. I will try to be not too provocative. But if you ask almost anyone about the state of Russia-EU relations, you will be offered plenty of competent or maybe not so competent opinions on what the other side should or shouldn't do. In such a context, desire for the compromise dissolves in efforts to prove one's truth or get the better of the other in an argument. This is a convenient moment for those dreaming to dust off old skeletons from Cold War closets. Let's come back to our very recent history. 70 years ago, not so far, in March 1946, Winston Churchill made a speech in the American town Fulton, which many call the beginning of the new confrontation of two political systems. Of course, rivalry didn't emerge because of the speech by them former and yet to be Prime Minister of Britain. The cause lay in the diverging interest of the anti-Hitler coalition. The Soviet Union was apprehensive of a new aggression by new former allies. Nuclear race was underway. Europe's stone was tied by the American alliance, having delegated its defense sovereignty to NATO, and the next 40 years witnessed a face-off of very high intensity. Probably that was even unavoidable in the context of the struggle between the communist and capitalist system. During the time of seeking expansion of the influence and putting pressure on partners, and few tried seeking mutual benefit from the constructive interactions. But even in that situation, a number of Western and Soviet politicians, including President de Gaulle, de Gaulle, Chancellor Brandt, Prime Minister Khrushchev, and even Churchill himself, tried to change the tone of the discourse. One of the instruments of the rapprochement, along with personal head of state meetings, was a cooperation in the humanitarian sphere, including science, education, culture. We all remember joint work in physics of the Soviet Academy of Science institutions, with the institutes of the Germany, France, Italy, Britain, Soviet-American Apollo project, many others. However, despite a number of successful projects, the spirit of rivalry and misunderstanding prevented changing the format of the relations until the 80s and the beginning of the 90s saved. That time witnessed a purposeful change of the rhetoric by the both parties and a number of steps to cardinally change the world's geopolitical landscape. The Cold War ended, and Russia closed democratic values which upholds today. Why then, after almost 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we turn more and more often to the relationship format it entitled? Perhaps maybe because it's not just the army generals always prepares for the last war, but also many contemporary politicians prepare to the past world order. Let's face the truth. One of the main reasons of the returning confrontation is that the end of the bipolar system was treated by many of the West, and maybe not only in the West, maybe in the other country, our country also, as a sign of the victory and the proof of the primacy of the power politics and success of the external pressure. This has put a very unstable foundation under the emerging configuration of the global and the regional politics. It is true that European Union members have demonstrated willingness to strategic partnership and cooperation, but only as a part of convergence on the basis of the Western ideologies and values, if not outright interests, regardless of how sensible Russia was to this controversial approach. And yet, the West doesn't stop seeking pretexts to label Russia as a bad guy. In fact, it is hard for us to believe that any compromises or steps toward Europe may change that. Therefore, the policy of the double red lines remains the only way to have our opinion counted. As soon as we are drawn a red line for, we draw one in return. It's fair. By the way, it was stated and explained clearly in President Putin's Munich speech in 2007. Unfortunately, it wasn't listened to. The so-named 5 new guidelines for the EU-Russia relationship, announced by the High Representative of the European Union for the Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, they demonstrate Europe's willingness to return to the old world by the freezing practically every form of the dialogue and interstate interaction forum created by the past decades. I stress the interstate, because more the new European approach, because it was the difference because the interstate cooperation and the cooperation with the civil society, the European approach seeks to put a wedge between the Russian society and the Russian state. It's also very sensible. Its result cannot be limited to economic losses or lost profits, however painful they are for the both sides. The price for the rejection of the cooperation may be much higher. I mean the decline of security globally. The world stability today already experiences colossal stress. Hotspots appear one after the one. Each new confrontation risks becoming a match for the global wildfire. Not only has the 3 decades window of the opportunity been virtually lost, but so apparently the understanding of the main achievement of the second half of the 20th century, almost 70 years of the peace in the Europe. Dear colleagues, in the Churchill-Fulton speech, besides the call to the confrontation, there was another aspect, which reminded of the shadow, a thought that the old world order had ended. Countries need to create a new world, seek new rules, create, as we say today, the new normal. Today we must acknowledge as well that the world has changed. The post-World War II order doesn't exist, but the one that emerged with the dissolution of the USSR is also gone and will never be the same. Even besides the local armed conflict, which number has been ever growing since the 90s, today we pass through the throes of the crisis, face new threats, and meet grand challenges. The problems in EU-Russia relations are much less serious than issues of migration, of terrorism, ecology, of inequality, which mentioned in the speech of the Ruth Marin. And all these problems increase the socio-economic instability in Europe and in the world, I think. Pandemics or climate change may not sound as threatening as war, but don't become unharmful to people's quality of their life. For example, the increasing antibiotic resistance can roll our protection against simple infection back to the middle of the last century. We forgot that very simple sepsis will be the end of the lives of the majority of the people. But we can return to this place in the nearest 10 years because of some medical problems. The grand challenges which motivate science around the world, are similar for the different countries, US and China, India and Japan, EU members and Russia. All of them are related in one way or another with the people's quality of the life. Answering these challenges and finding new opportunities requires an entirely new level of research and education. Incidentally, in this area, where Russia and Europe has been consistently succeeding in cooperation, among the 4 common spaces between Russia and EU, it was research, education, and culture that succeeded the most. It is telling that Russia was the most active third-party country in all of the EU's framework programs. In Hamburg and Darmstadt, in Cadarache and Geneva, together we create unique scientific units, allowing to obtain previously unavailable data about the life and inorganic matter, come close to understanding the creating of our universe, create new ecological clean energy sources. Only in the last few years, Russia has invested over €1.5 billion in this joint project in Europe. Thousands of the Russian specialists work there and work very hard. I think you will agree that this is a significant contribution to the common European competitiveness as a part of the neighborhood policy. Education, intellectual development, rooted in a culture and history, are also important strategic factors in the development of society. We shouldn't forget the importance of the common Russian-European values, from the religion to culture, from common history to the very development of the statehood and economy. Dear colleagues, tempora mutantur, as Romans said. We are the verge of the new world order. What it will be like? The place will our countries have in it? I doubt any knows the answer. So, it is all the more important to create opinion-sharing channels and platforms for developing common approaches and institutes for the cooperation. We should create them in the areas presenting in the joint interest, using the institutions like the estimate organizer of our conference and the European University Institute. All of us know how difficult it may be in our world to keep good relations with sacrificing vital sovereign interests. Compromising is not the only key to successful peace negotiations and neighborhood policy. Understanding others, recognizing the right to be the different, have different interests and different identity. These matters are important not only for the people, but also for the countries and the government. As well as the people, countries have the right to be the various. I think that we are ready to willing to create a common space, to bring closer our science, education, culture. We seek collective security and an interconnected economy. We don't think that peace and prosperity in the whole of Europe can be achieved without our joint movement in this direction. But we want this to take place on the equitable and mutually acceptable basis. What we propose to seek is not tactical compromise in a zero-sum game, but a strategy for the mutual benefits. It's the strengthening of the good neighborhood between Russia and Europe. I won't repeat once more. We have to find the win-win strategy, but not the balance between the contradiction interest. My dear friends, yesterday when I'm first time in Florence. Yesterday, me and my colleagues looked the square, which named in the memory of the Beslan Bambina. I was nominated the Minister of the Education in the spring of the 2004. My first September as a minister, it was this terroristic action in the Beslan. I was in the Beslan just after the tragedy. And in the night after the tragedy, after the death of the more than 100 young people, and not only young, but their mothers, because mainly the women who was with the children in the school on the 1st September. I remember as it was yesterday, the yard with full of the dead bodies of the children, of their mothers on the one side, and the dead bodies of the terrorists on the other side. And after that, on this day, on the next one, I met with the mothers, with some mothers who saved their children, and with some mothers who lose their children. You see, after that, every 1st September, for me, it's not the holiday. Every 1st September, I sit and ask the God not to repeat this story. You see, when we be in the face in such things, we understand that mainly all other problems is a rather small one. I think that we, the people of Europe, the people of the world, have to concentrate on the common basement, which can give us additional opportunity to establish more comfortable for us, for all of us, the world. And because of it, in the provocative name of my presentation, partnership versus brinksmanship, I think we can give only one answer. But we can not only give the answer, but we have to show how to do it. Thank you. Понятно было или не очень?
Thank you very much. I cannot but ask the first question related to the theme of the State of the Union. Now, I think most of you would agree with me that if you just ask the average person about gender equality in Europe, most people would say, well, it's guaranteed in our constitutions, we have courts, there might be small problems here or there, but basically that's not item number 1, 2, or 3 that should occupy our society. And one of the very important things that occurred today, for example, in the State of the Union speech by Professor Rubio Marin, was to destabilize that view, to take us out of our complacency, and not only to show that there is a problem, but to show that there's a profound problem that affects millions, that we cannot be self-congratulatory or complacent. Now, when I think of the old Soviet Union, it was very proud that as part of its ideology, there was equality among the sexes. But I also remember when seeing pictures of the Politburo on the 1st of May, etc., it was mostly old men and very, very, very few women at all.
I'm
so,
sorry.
So I want to ask you, first of all, what was the reality then? Has it changed today for the better, for the worse? Do you think this is a major issue in your country?
You see, as usual, we have two sides of this coin. One of this is that it's some official and formal parts. And formally, we have, of course, the really huge involvement of the women. In our parliament, it's, I think, maybe even more than half. You know that the head of the upper chamber of our parliament, the head is a woman, is Valentina Matvienko. And she's really very bright and smart person. We also have women in all positions. When I was a minister, I work very closely, and we are still the friends with the two absolutely fantastic women. One of them now is the chair of the Central Bank of Russia, is Elvira Nabiulina. Another one is chair of the controlling committee, счетная палата, the counting committee. The counting committee, I don't know about Italy, in Russia it's a very important part of our establishment. But I can tell you that, of course, when we look about in education, we have a lot of women and very distinguished women as professors, but a very few one as rectors of the university. All of them elected. All of them elected by the staff of the university, not nominated by the. More than over, we have a few universities, federal universities, which have the, which in which rectors nominated, the percentage of the women in these universities is higher than in universities which elected by the professors and the staff of the university. So it means that maybe the main problem is the problem of the mentality of the society. I think that it's changed. And it's changed because of the, from my point of view, I like to work with the women, maybe because maybe they're more, sometimes they're more smart and more available. More reliable, yeah, more reliable sometimes. But once more, it's a process. It's a process. And the answer on this and how to do it, I think it's a policy which also important for the, which realized also in the Europe, and not only in the Russia. We are a part of the Europe, as we keep in mind the geography. Remember that at least some part of the big part of the Europe is Russia. We have to change, we have to prepare some additional opportunity. And now, step by step, I think we have more women in the power. They're interested, and we will help them. At least position of the officials, top officials of the Russia, really oriented on this one. About the young people, it's also we have the opportunity. But you see, now we have another problem. Very few young people really want to take responsibility for themselves. For example, we have problems to find young people who will be ready to be the directors of the institutions or rectors of university, because it's a huge responsibility, and along with limitation for the freedom. And also one thing, you're not also responsible for everything, but also in case of some problems, it's your fault. And the young people prefer to pretend to some other officials, maybe more elder officials, than to take this responsibility for themselves. So I don't know if it's the answer on your question, but I think that it's not only Russian. I think it's a more or less international problem.
I have great sympathy to that last point. At the EUI, we have a less than spectacular gender balance. It's my fault.
Yes.
Can we turn a little bit to politics? And one important theme in your address to us was the need to relate to the other side and to understand them. Now, there are two types of disagreement. There can be, I understand you perfectly well, I simply disagree with you. But there's also disagreement that you would say, if you really understood me, we would have less disagreement. Where do you think we in Europe and we in the European Union most misunderstand Russia today?
Good question. Who knows?
You mean it's a long list?
Maybe it's your secret. I try to give my vision. I'm not sure that is the real truth. It's once more, it's my vision. You see, very serious Europe, not only Europe, concentrate very strongly on the diversity of the people. And I think it's important. All people have to be different and have the, and it's very important that the people have the rights to be the different. Very different, in a very different direction. But simultaneously, some of our partners from Europe, from the United States, prefer that the societies, institutions, and maybe countries was more or less similar to the countries which they see in the Europe, or maybe in, for example, as the United States. And the problem is that if the people are very different, some societies of the people also can propose the other's country, others' approaches, and create the frame for them and demand the frame which have to be realized. Sometimes, from my point of view, once more, it's a mistake. More than over, we look at in the Middle East. Some of us, some of our partners were sure that it will be better for the Middle East countries if they change their governance in the more or less similar to the Western countries way. But we see, we lose much more countries that even in these maybe non-democratic regimes. I understand that it's very hard to agree that some non-democracy governance in some countries. But let's keep in the mind that the treasury of the human life is also very high. And I remember that President Reagan tells that we have some things which much more important than peace. You know that maybe it can take to tell the person who have no such experience in the Russia about the peace and war. When you lose during the Second World War more than 20 million people, and every family, including my family, lose somebody. We have a little other mentality. So, if you answer on your question, maybe we have to agree that the other mentality is not the contradicting mentality. It's necessary better to think what's the roots for this mentality, and maybe it will be easier after that to talk about the different things.
One more concrete political question, and then we'll shift gear a little bit. When you think of the foreign policy of the European Union as such, acting as the European Union, not France, not Britain, but the European Union, do you think that they are sufficiently robust, that sufficiently independent, that Europe is sufficiently using its potential in foreign policy, in shaping the direction of the world, etc.? Because inside we hear critique that we have not succeeded in translating, for example, our economic strength to independent foreign policy.
Yes. First of all, to be absolutely independent, impossible. We always depend on somebody. We depend in the very concrete level on our family, yeah? And we have no chance to be absolutely independent. About the foreign policy, I don't think that they're really independent. It was orders which was created rather long time ago, maybe 70 years, And when really, I can repeat once more, European countries, Europe delegate some part of their responsibility for the defense to the common structures with supervised by your partners under the ocean. And it's not so easy to change it drastically. We remember the attempt of the de Gaulle to change this approach. And it wasn't very successful, not because the de Gaulle wasn't strong enough, but because it's a lot of reasons, not only as an image of the enemies from the side of the Russia, not only. You see, everybody afraid that will be some terrible terrible enemies, as a terrorist, for example. And we need some senior brother. You see? So I don't think that Europe in the foreign policy is fully independent. But once more, it doesn't mean that we can and we want to change it. It's your problem and it's your decision. The problem is that we want to keep in the mind our position also. In some sense, also dependence on the position of the neighbor. When you have a neighbor, you have, for example, after the midnight to keep silent, if you want to have a good relation with the neighbor. And I think we can talk about it also in such things when we talk about the relation with the countries.
Can I switch completely direction? Both your comments and my questions are posited about the relationship between Europe and Russia. I grew up.
You want the negative?
I grew up in a home that when my father got angry, he would switch into Russian. And in that milieu, Leningrad or St. Petersburg were part of Europe. There was a part of Russia that was not Europe, but...
Geographically, at least.
But culturally, I actually, without even thinking, later articulated Russian literature. Brothers Karamazov that's part of, always I thought, European cultural heritage. Yes. How do you feel about that in cultural identity?
Of course, we are Europeans. Of course, of course, we are not full Europeans. We have some part of the Asian culture, you see, and it's very important. Once more, the diversity is very important, and I think it's very interesting for Europe also that we have some. If we will be just the same, it's not so interesting. We can be more rich if we use and we have something different from our neighbors, from our neighbors, for our partners and for our friends. But of course, when I'm from St. Petersburg, from Leningrad. I was born in Leningrad. And my parents and my grandparents also was there. And so, of course, as a part of this culture, as a part of this history, and because of it, but you know that I don't think that it was famous in the, yes, it was famous in the Europe, but in the Soviet Union it was very usual. So, коммунальные квартиры, what I don't know how to say. Common flats in which live not one but a few families, and a few families. You see, and it was a communist idea that it's a much better relations between the people who live in one flat and use with the one some kitchen and so on. But the most terrible scandals in the Soviet Union was in these communal flats, because sometimes it's better to have the separate flats and to meet in the common common space, common flats. And it's exactly why I said that we have to construct, we have to manufacture the common space, the common flats. We have the good experience. We created always, even in the very cold time, science, education, and culture. And now, because we relax a little, we began to don't afraid to lose it. And maybe the last words, I understand that the time finished. Let's save what we have. It's very important. We improve it, but for the beginning, let's save what we had. It's important. We had a lot of.
I'm afraid our time are up. Let's save what we have. Also in the relationship between Russia and the European University Institute. I really thank you very, very much. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going to break for lunch and meet again at 2:30 for the next session. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Fosenko.
Okay, thank you. At least I feel your...
Participants who leave Palazzo Vecchio this afternoon are reminded that they must re-enter before 5:30. No entry to Palazzo Vecchio will be allowed after 5:30. Thank you.